The conversation this evening will be led by one of the members of our committee, the Committee of Central London Humanists, Alavari Jibatho, who's the National Coordinator of Young Humanists UK. And our guest is Maryam Namazie, an Iranian-born writer and activist. She's the spokesperson of One Law for All and the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. She hosts a weekly television program broadcast in Iran on Saturday evenings in both Persian and English called Bread and Roses. She's an international advisory board of the Raif Badawi Foundation for Freedom and Euromind, and it's a laureate of the International Academy of Humanism. She has received many awards for her work, including being a joint winner of the 2019 Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize. She's been awarded the 2017 Henry Zumack Freedom from Religious Fundamentalism Award. In 2016, she won the International Secularism Prize from the Comité Laïcité République and was honored by the National Secular Society for her campaigning work defending free speech at universities in 2016, despite attempts at barring her by student unions or the Islamic Society efforts to intimidate and cancel her talks. Please welcome Maryam Namazie and AJ.
Her real name is Sheena. She's from Iranian Kurdistan, but in Iran, Kurdish names are banned, and that's why we know her by the name Mahsa Amini. She was visiting Tehran. She was stopped by the guidance patrol or morality police as she was coming out of the metro. She was veiled, but according to them, she was improperly veiled. And they dragged her, arrested her, and even though her teenage brother pleaded to let her go because they had no one there to help them, they dragged her off for re-education. And the van could have looked something like this. Others who were with her in the van said that she was severely beaten. And every year we know that guidance patrol harass and arrest and brutalize millions of women. The morality police, preventing vice and promoting virtue, that's what they call it, a real-life Handmaid's Tale. Now this was Mahsa Amini before they took her. Women's voices are banned in Iran as well. And this is Mahsa Amini after they took her. The regime said she had a heart attack, but scans from the hospital show that she had a fractured skull. She arrived at Castro Hospital in Tehran brain dead. She went in a healthy woman with her whole life ahead of her, and she came out of the regime's detention centers in a coma, dying on the 16th of September, murdered for a few strands of hair. Her death outraged and sparked outrage in Iran. At her funeral, Kurdish women shouted Jan Azadi, which is Women Life Freedom, a slogan that was first raised in feminist Rojava. And on her gravestone, her parents wrote, "Dear Gina, you will not die, your name will be a symbol." And so it has. Now, 5 weeks into protests in Iran, continuing unabated, the courage and bravery of women and girls on the streets have captured the world's imagination. Protests led by women and girls, removing and burning their hijabs with men by their side. The most visible form of Islamic rule, the veil on women, is now the target and the symbol of our women's revolution. Young generation, flouting Islamic rules, the regime came to power and imposed compulsory veiling by shouting either veil or a punch, and they threw acid in women's faces and pinned women's hijabs on their heads with pins. And here are young children saying, neither veil nor a punch, freedom and equality. Kicking out officials of the Islamic regime, tearing up photos of Khamenei and Khomeini from their classrooms, and writing women life freedom instead. As usual, it's met with repression. The regime is using weapons of war. They've even attacked Evin prison, where the best of our best are being held. Setting off explosions, there's video footage of security officials actually putting more petrol on the flames. And there are reports that between 40 to 100 prisoners, including political prisoners, have been killed. Many have been disappeared. Over 12,500 people have so far been arrested. That's according to human rights groups, including the 2 women journalists who first brought the news of Mahsa's murder to the public. Officials say that the average age of those arrested is 15 years old. So far, human rights groups know of around 250 protesters killed. Many of them are children. The numbers.
Thanks, JC, and thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, I think that video really puts things into sharp perspective, and we're so honored to have Maryam here with us to explore this issue further. Thank you, Maryam, for joining us. I mean, you've given a lot of interviews, I can imagine, a very intense period for you and for the Council of Ex-Muslims in Britain. And unfortunately, we've learned that you had to leave at 7:30, so only an hour. We'd hope to be able to stay longer, but we will continue the discussion afterwards, unfortunately, if you have to leave then. But let's make the most of the time that you have. And as I say, you've had a lot of interviews and a lot of media engagement with this. So I guess I wanted to get into it maybe from the UK humanist perspective, which is what sort of where most of us are coming from. Some of us are from Europe, but I see in the chat that many of us are from the UK and from London, as you are based here as well. Can you speak about why, just to get into the issue, why is it an issue of humanist concern, shall we say? And is there something perhaps that in all of the interviews that you've done that you've felt has not been emphasized as much, one aspect of the situation, and then we can take on the discussion from there?
Well, thank you very much to the Central London Humanist Group for inviting me. Thank you for all of you who are here today. It's lovely to see some friendly faces as well, and old friends. It's been a long time, so I'm glad to see you all here today. I think with this regards, I think, of course, this is an issue for everyone that cares about, of course, human rights, and that cares about women's rights issues, and is concerned about the role that fundamentalism has played across our globe. And we're talking, of course, here in this instance, Islamic fundamentalism, but we know that there's been a corresponding rise with other forms of fundamentalism as well. You know, the Christian fundamentalism and its attack on, again, women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBT rights, all various rights, and also the Hindu right in India, the Buddhist right in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, of course, the Jewish right in the Palestinian territory. So we have seen a corresponding rise in the rise of the religious right. And I think in contemporary history, it's very much linked to the establishment of an Islamic regime in Iran. If we look at photos and read about the situation in countries across the Middle East, for example, over 40 years ago, it's a very different image that we would get than we do today. And I think, again, it shows how much the Islamist movement has had a negative, adverse effect on people's lives. And so I think from that perspective alone, this is a hugely important revolution that is bringing hope, I think, and inspiring people across the globe. And I think what's important here is the fact that an Islamic regime in Iran came to power by imposing the veil. It was the first thing it did, compulsory veiling for people who worked in government offices. It started there. And it's interesting.
It was unpopular
now
right from the beginning.
I'm sorry?
It was unpopular right from the beginning.
It was, exactly. It
Yeah.
was unpopular right from the beginning. And there was actually a huge mass protest of women in 1979 for March 8th, International Women's Day, opposed to compulsory veiling. And of course, they were beaten and had acid attacks and all of the things that was mentioned in the video as well. And this was pushed back. Nonetheless, women have been fighting against compulsory veiling laws in various ways. But what we're seeing today is the very veil that has been the symbol of this regime, the most visible symbol of this regime, is now being burnt and removed by a very young generation that has, no qualms with any aspect of Islam in power, doesn't want an Islamic state. And I think you're seeing a great deal of anti-clericalism within this movement and a demand for sort of secular modern values.
And you mentioned young people there. So is that, are we seeing there that they sort of had their patience? They've sort of given the revolution a chance to whatever degree, as you say, even it was unpopular right from the beginning. But they see now that there is no, in their opinion, in the Iranian context at the moment, there is no future, there is no breathing space for young women who may not have been anti-Islam necessarily before or 5-10 years ago, but now they see the chokehold is so strong that everything has to go, and it is that widespread of a revolution. And is that feeling only really in the young, or is that spreading to perhaps the aunties, the housewives, the grandmas, the more maybe conservative aspects of women in Iran?
I think the question is not that people gave the regime a chance. I think the reality is that anybody who's lived in a theocracy or under religious rules, or maybe there'll be people here who've lived in very religious fundamentalist families, there is this constant conflict between what you want and how you want to live your life, what you want to think, what you want to wear, what music you want to listen to, very basic things, just basic things are in conflict with that sort of very fundamentalist worldview. And of course, then here we're talking about a state that's imposing it with brute force and with violence. And so I think there's always been this conflict. And I think if you look at this period of the 40 plus years that the regime has been in power, we've seen constant pushback and various protest movements, many of which have been suppressed, but they've always moved society forward. I think one of the main differences today is that, one, we're dealing with a very young generation. I mean, schoolgirls, young women, Generation Z, and this is a generation that might really be the first generation that has had access to portable digital media and social media from a very young age. So I think that is one thing. So they've already had complete access to the world with all the restrictions that are imposed on them. And also, they're not unknown. You know, a lot of times, I think a lot of you will know, is if someone was being stoned or someone was being executed, a lot of times we might not even have known their first names. We might know them by initials. Whereas here you've got a generation that have TikTok accounts, Instagram accounts. Their last moments are being shown to the world, really. You know, Nika Shah Karami, the 16-year-old who was killed, right before she was taken by the government forces. There's a video of her burning her hijab. And the video footage follows her until she disappears, and then her body is given to her family 10 days later. You know, her skull smashed in and her teeth broken, her cheekbones dislocated. So we get to know these young people. And also, I think protests in the past might have had, at least at its start, some sort of illusion towards aspects of the Islamic State, you know, the so-called reformers. I think that was a really clever way of the regime to open the safety valve, and, you know, because of the explosive situation. So I think now this generation has no illusions, and no one does. And I think the murder of Mahsa Amini just broke the camel's back, you know, was the last straw. And we're seeing that is the case. It's been
and you're seeing that now spreading even to the more conservative women, older women outside of Tehran. In your opinion, is that spreading as much as it is amongst the globalized sort of TikTok generation within Tehran?
Yeah, definitely. I think it is something that is affecting all generations, all classes, and we see that very clearly in the protests, including people who are being killed. They're not only children being killed, you know, there are different age groups being killed, and you see lots
being disappeared.
And disappeared and arrested, and lots of older people as well. So I think this is, you know, it's the bravery and courage of this young generation, I think, that has given lots of people who might have stayed at home previously the courage to come out. And the sea of people we're seeing, not just in Iran, but also in protests within the Iranian diaspora. It is the largest protest ever seen. And I think, you know, people are talking about it as being a women's revolution, particularly if you consider the fact that the main slogan is Woman, Life, Freedom, a slogan that was first raised in Rojava, and of course also raised first in the Kurdish Iran regions at Mahsa Amini's funeral, which is in Saqqez, Iranian Kurdistan.
And talking about the young generation, demographically, Iran was remarkably different from many other countries. I think around 50% or over 50% of the population was born after the revolution. So they're fairly young, in their 30s, 40s, and all they've known is this kind of imposition and religious theocracy. So there's not much more room to back up in that sense. Could you sort of paint a picture more about these? So these guidance patrols, technically, you know, morality police, many will call them. How do they operate? Or are there women who are actually part of these patrols and parts of the officers? And because that's also an aspect, isn't it? Using women to repress women, unfortunately, using the blanket of Islamic diktat.
Yes, there are definitely women in the morality police. But as you see, you know, there's supposed to be sex segregation in Iran. So Women, for example, sit at the back of the bus, like racial apartheid in South Africa. They have to enter separate government doors of government buildings from men. There's a curtain in the sea, for example, separating men and women. Women aren't allowed into football stadiums. And of course, there's this idea that if you're not closely related to a woman, you're no mahram, you cannot shake hands with women or see them without their hijab, that sort of thing. So that's why there are women morality police, of course, but as you can see from the footage, you know, that sort of segregation is only what they impose on society. When they want to repress, they forget about those rules, and you see men beating women, attacking them, manhandling them. And of course, there's lots of examples of, being sexually abused, rape threats, and even rape of those who are arrested by the morality police. And according to their own statistics, it is millions of women every year, you know, so the scene that you saw on that video footage is something that happens regularly. And I think I think it's not an exaggeration to say that there won't be one family in Iran that hasn't had their daughters and also sons, because if boys are, but of course the focus is on women and girls, and girls from a very young age, because you're supposed to wear the hijab from puberty, but also boys and men who might have long hair or dressed, in a way that might seem too fashionable, whatever, they can be harassed as well, though the focus is on women, of course, and girls.
Or let alone maybe dressing a bit feminine or gay. That's not tolerated at all, I'm guessing. And so this is not only in Tehran, just to emphasize, or also in Isfahan and some of the other, there's many big cities, but even in some of the more conservative areas, of course, the capital, London is not the UK, Tokyo is not Japan, there's always that New York is not US. The capital tends to always be more trendy and maybe a bit more open to culturalization, globalization, but then also the repression is greater there. But also even in the other conservative rest of the country, the guidance, the morality police, the repression there is just as harsh, you would say, as it is in Tehran.
Well, I mean, obviously, in bigger cities, it will be more
population-wise.
The numbers, depending on population.
But relatively.
But also, I think, I mean, if you look at the recent protests, there have been protests in over 125 cities in Iran, including in Qom, which is the center of religious learning. There's been protests there, and so. I think also we have a very highly educated population. I think
the female literacy is amazing, like 80% or so. I wanted to ask about, we'll discuss that a bit later on actually, because under the Islamic Revolution or these decades, women's literacy is sort of, they've allowed it to go up, or they couldn't help it going up, or universities and so on. That surely is maybe setting a rod for their own backs from the mullah's perspective, from the Islamic perspective, because once you get education, you're bound to get revolution somewhere down the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is very key. You are dealing with a very educated population. You're also dealing with a very politicized population, because, if you look at, for example, the effects of the French Revolution, for example, we still talk about the effects of laïcité and the 1908 law separating the church and the state as a result of the French Revolution centuries before. And I think in the same way, you had a very a revolution only 40 something years ago in Iran. So that politicization of the population has been ongoing, as well as, highly educated population. And also the fact that there isn't a family who hasn't had a run-in with the morality police, because it's not only if you are a political dissident or a, someone who is
public figure, known person, troublemaker.
It's anyone who, it's, if you go to a party, if you hold hands with your lover, if you kiss on the street, if you dance, if you're a woman and you sing, so every aspect of daily living comes into conflict with the regime's forces. And that's why, there is no way that yes, that's right. So it's not just education levels. I think for me, the most key thing is the fact that you have
global awareness,
revolution has
globalization.
politicized population. And the revolution wasn't an Islamic revolution. It was a revolution against dictatorship of the Shah for freedom. Unfortunately, it was expropriated by the Islamic movement, but it wasn't initially an Islamic revolution. And I think especially foreign policy of Western governments at the time was to create a green belt around the Soviet Union. They preferred a fundamentalist, government, and they had a meeting in Guadeloupe. That's now all been declassified.
Could we, I think on the point about it's not only politicized women or public figures that are at fault, and just as an illustration of that, I think the most famous one is involving a public figure was Shireen Ebadi, who was a judge she's now in exile here in the UK, but she, again, going back to the point of how resisted this was and how ludicrous this was, even right after the revolution. Was it not the day or the week after the Islamists came into power, she was turning up for work as a judge without the hijab, obviously, because it wasn't mandated before. And then she was told that she couldn't come into work to do her legal work. And she had to either, I think I heard Ahmed Jalili say this, she was told either, well, you can either be a janitor or be a clerk or something, but we're not going to allow you to be a judge. So much for the ideals of the revolution and making it more free for the people of the country.
I mean, Shireen Ebadi is one of the women who obviously, she was a judge prior to the establishment of Islamic regime. The reason she was not allowed to be a judge anymore is because, as you know, women are too emotional and they cannot make rational decisions, which is why we cannot have women judges. And interestingly, it's the same line of reasoning which requires 2 women witnesses for every man, because it is for one woman to be able to remind the other woman, because obviously you can't have women and men on equal footing. So I think from that perspective is why she was no longer allowed to be a judge. I do want to add that I think Shireen Ebadi has very much supported a sort of reformist faction of the regime for a very long time. I think that's why she is able to get a Nobel Peace Prize, and many others who are deserving of it wouldn't be able to. But I think things have changed so much that you are seeing people who were previously reformers, and by reformers, I mean Islamic reformers, which is an oxymoron really, but it was the sort of illusion that change could come via a faction of the Islamic regime. But I think now things have changed drastically, and very clearly we're seeing the anti-clericalism and the secular sort of modern demands, very woman-centered demands of this new generation that is going to change the face of Iran and the Middle East if it succeeds. But to succeed, it needs a lot of support from the public everywhere. And I think that's something that is very key to stress here.
Yes, and maybe another difference, I'm not sure if you'd also agree, is that there's no obvious figurehead or epicenter for these protests as there were maybe in previous protests. It really is so decentralized, and because of social media and the technological capabilities, I mean, even I think using things like Starlink, the global internet service, you can then circumvent internet shutdowns, which we see in many of these in Egypt, in the Arab Spring we're also seeing them now in Iran. So that ability means that there is no sort of head of the snake to cut off, as it were, for the regime.
Sure, but there are definitely leaders there in Iran who are organizing and who are well respected. We might not know them. We will know them when this revolution succeeds. And I think it was the same during the Iranian Revolution. I mean, Khomeini came from Iraq via Paris, so he wasn't even in Iran at the time. But a lot of things can be imposed from above, and I think that's a huge risk, a real risk, that Western governments, Russian
imported NGO policies,
imposing their demands on this revolution. So I think it's really crucial for people to keep pressure on their governments, not to intervene in Iran, in Iranian politics, in the sense of not making regime change from above. Obviously, Western governments, there was a great banner at one of the protests. It said, "Iranian women don't need you to save them." It was addressed to Western leaders. But we do need you to stop saving our murderers. And I think that is a very clear message, that it's this constant relationships and wheeling and dealings and recognition and legitimization that's given to the Iranian regime, no matter what it does and how many it kills. And I think that pressure is hugely important. I was just looking at some documents from the anti-apartheid era, because I think there's so much you can learn from that wonderfully brilliant sort of revolutionary movement. And one of the things that Nelson Mandela had said was that the international solidarity work was key in bringing an end to racial apartheid in South Africa. And I think that those of us who are not just from the Iranian diaspora, but just the public at large, humanists, secularists particularly, that this is something that is an important task, really, to ensure that, one, the British government stops supporting the regime, and there are various things that can be done around that, but also to constantly ensure that there's focus on this revolution so that it doesn't go out of the news and out of sights and minds.
And the cultural boycott, the South Africa example, the cultural boycott was also very, there are multiple factors there. Angola, the defeat, the military defeat in Angola, as well as also US, Reagan pulling his support. He was sort of holding out, and other countries pulled their support for ANC much earlier, but Reagan was sort of the last holding on. US pulling the support. There were many factors, but one of the major factors, I think you're very right to point that out, the cultural boycotts, especially in the sports world. I mean, that's very much for the average person who is not politicized, to see that, okay, now Iran or South Africa, a part of South Africa, is no longer welcome in sort of the community, global community of sports, or there's problems there. That can be very useful to highlight that. There was that Iranian climber, wasn't there? Was it in Asia? Elnaz Rekabi, I think her name was. Yeah, also in Seoul. So that was an excellent example. You could talk about that. You think that was a very powerful, although she was made to recant afterwards once she got back to Iran.
There is some petitions going around, for example, to not allow Iranian teams, whilst these sort of repressions and the sex apartheid is taking place. So I think those are one of the ways in which we can help to put pressure on the regime. With this climber, I mean, she bravely removed her hijab, climbed, and yet, afterwards she was put under immense pressure. She's under house arrest. She was forced to give an interview on Iranian TV saying that, her hijab slipped off and all of this. And clearly we know that
she forgot a wardrobe malfunction or something like this,
exactly.
But she was obviously being pressured to say that. Yeah,
exactly. So I mean, the real her is her climbing, without a hijab. What she says in Iran under all of that pressure and threats is, I think, clearly what the regime wants her to say.
And could you say something about, sort of jumping back a bit, with Mahsa Amini being from the Kurdish population there, as well as also repression against women generally? For example, I think she has a Kurdish name and Kurdish language and culture. That's also sort of, it's not just only a sexism sort of issue, but also culturally, the Kurdish population there have been persecuted, or their language, has been persecuted as well. Could you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I had mentioned that at the beginning of the video that you had shown.
Yes, it was mentioned in the
conference.
Yeah.
That her name is Gina, but in Iran you're not allowed to have Kurdish names on your documentation, and that's why her name is Mahsa, and that's why we all know her as Mahsa Amini, but her name is Gina. She preferred the name Gina, and on her, for example, on the headstone on her grave, it says, "Dear Gina, you haven't died. You're going to be a symbol. You know, your name will be a symbol." And at her 40th death anniversary, you know, after 40 days, the family had a ceremony at her gravesite, and the regime issued a statement saying that they're not going to have any ceremony, and the family then had to come and say, "No, we are having a ceremony for her." And the regime tried to block all the routes towards the funeral, and you know, the sea of
in her
tens
hometown
of thousands of people, you know, coming towards her gravesite was just something always just so inspiring to see. And they couldn't even stop people from going there. So there is, you know, there is a reason why Women Life Freedom started in Saqqez. There is that link to the Kurdish struggle and the fact that Rojava is a center of feminism in a war zone,
the Kurdish capital
in Syria. So, you know, and the slogan "Women Life Freedom" started there in Rojava. It was raised again at Mahsa's funeral, and it's just taken hold of the entire world. And I think it's such a deep, such a profound slogan, such a universal slogan. And I think that's one of the reasons why this movement has so captured the world's attention.
Should we in the UK, do you think, be supporting sanctions against Iran? Because there is the argument that it also hurts sanctions against, you see in the Russian context, and authoritarian governments usually tend to use external threats as an excuse to persecute their population even more. Or do you think sanctions actually help to diplomatically isolate and target Iran and keep it in the crosshairs? Is it productive or counterproductive?
I think sanctions are hugely important, particularly if it's sanctions of weapons, if it's sanctions of, you know, any sort of equipment that might have dual purposes, but can also be used for repression. We know, for example, that the Iranian regime is using weapons of war, illegal under international law, against the protesters. There have been evidence of, for example, some of the non-lethal weapons used are from the UK. Again, it could have been bought many years ago, but nonetheless, you know, you've got reports of political prisoners saying that they're, what's it called? Sorry, I've forgotten the word. You know, the wrist handcuffs, sorry. I don't know. Handcuffs are made in England, for example. So there is a whole range of things that are applicable with regard to sanctions, but also it's a lot more than that. It's about preventing officials of the regime from
targeted sanctions,
targeting them, freezing their assets, because a lot of them,
Putin's oligarchs,
a lot of them have families they've who are living abroad. A lot of them have moved their money outside. So it's targeting them. It's targeting Islamic regimes' embassies. Why not expel ambassadors? Why not shut the embassies down? Why not? I mean, if we're not going to do it now, when is it going to happen? You know, when there's a women's revolution taking place, when the regime is using so much repression against protesters, it makes sense to do something more drastic, in a sense, have a more ethical position on this. Carrying on as if, you know, everything is business as usual is unethical. And if we look at, for example, statements made by the British government. It's all about condemnations. They're asking for an investigation into Mahsa's murder. It's asking the apartheid regime of South Africa to investigate the murder of Stephen Biko in its prisons or whatever. I mean, it's just, it's a farce. It's a joke. And we are seeing now these developments taking place in other countries. For example, in the UK, the Islamic regime of Iran has a number of Islamic centers, which are propaganda centers of the regime. The one in Maida Vale in London, for example, the head of that is a special representative of Ayatollah Khamenei himself. It's a charity, so it has millions of pounds in its bank account, and it is promoting hate and promoting the Islamic regime's line on things. It is threatening exiles, for example, who live in Britain, and so on and so forth. So in Germany, they have decided to expel the head of the Islamic Center there. The same can be done here in Britain. Iran, imagine, is on the UN Commission on the Status of Women. It's not even funny. Do you know what I mean? So in Canada, for example, they have resolved in their parliament to call for the expulsion of Iran from the Status of Women. These are practical things that can easily be done if there is political will. And we know that in reality, the UK government, Western governments, all governments prefer fundamentalists to feminists. I think in reality, that is the truth. And the only way they will do anything is through public pressure. It was the same with apartheid in South Africa. They called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. They continued to deal with the apartheid regime despite the fact that it was unethical and immoral to do so. And then there was such a groundswell of public pressure that the Western governments were unable to justify their support of the apartheid regime of South Africa any longer. And this is what has to be done with the Iranian regime.
Yeah, I guess in some sense, the best case scenario for political power in the US and UK is a fundamentalist regime there in Iran, which is, well, in some sense, if not, pro the West. I guess you wouldn't argue that it is, because of the US-Israel axis tends to be against Shia Iran and also Saudi Arabia, if not pro the West, but at least in some kind of trading relationships or oil or gas, and in some way part of the Washington sort of consensus and trade network there. And certainly, as you say, having a democracy there where the resources of the country are used for the people, and also more dissidents and education, human rights, and so on, would be bad for business, essentially, and bad for Middle East opportunities for the West. Should we, as the UK citizens, be calling for regime change in Iran outright, do you think? Or should we just be supporting the will and giving solidarity with women and other conscientious human rights favoring people in Iran and let them decide?
I mean, I obviously, in the 21st century, I don't think anyone can defend a theocracy. It's just antithetical to anything that has to do with human rights and life in the 21st century. So obviously, an end to theocracy is the minimum that any humanist and secularist should be calling for. And here you have a modern, progressive, secular, feminist movement in Iran calling for women, life, freedom. Their main slogans are, we don't want an Islamic state and we don't want an anti-woman state. So obviously it will, it is, I think, important for all of us to do as much as we can to support the protesters. The issue I have with the word regime change, in a way, is It's very much sounds like something that the US or Britain is going to do,
neoconservative,
and have done in Iran as well as many other places.
Yeah.
So it sort of sounds like something that happens from above. Right now, the slogan is the only solution is revolution, an end to Islamic rule. And of course, it's people in Iran that are going to decide their future. If people outside of Iran can make sure that their governments stop supporting the Islamic regime and also stop, making decisions on the future without people having a say, which is something that has happened before and could still happen.
We've got some questions. I think maybe now might be a good time to move towards the
Yes,
questions.
thank you so very much, Maryam, and thank you so much, AJ, for this conversation. We are aware that you have to leave, so we're going to start with a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat. I have 4 questions that have already come in. The first one asks Maryam, to what extent are men, young and old, supportive of the protests? And does the state enjoy wide support, or is it ruling by oppressive force?
Okay, so I think one of the things that we've seen in the protests in Iran is that men are very much standing side by side women, shouting women like freedom, and trying to defend women and men who are being dragged off by security forces. So I think it's very much men and women shoulder to shoulder in these protests. And I think if we look at, for example, the fact that there were situations where women were unsafe in Egypt, for example, during the protests, and there were reports of sexual assault and so on and so forth, that's something that is not happening in Iran. So men are very much on board with this sort of this demand for women life freedom and in opposition to compulsory veiling. And really, when you think about it, the idea of compulsory veiling is very dehumanizing towards men as well, because it says that men cannot control their urges if women are not covered, and it will cause rape and assaults against women if they're not covered. And so in a sense, you have it has caused men to feel dehumanized as well. And this slogan has meant a lot, I think, for men as well, because it changes the image that we have of both Iranian society, but also how people look at themselves. It's not through the eyes of the regime, but through the eyes of this sort of modern secular movement. I think obviously there are supporters of the Iranian regime in the same way that, you've got supporters for, you've got neo-Nazis that support Hitler. I mean, and, there are people that do. We have fascists here in Britain as well, that like Nigel Farage and, all of that. So they're obviously, there is a Islamists in Iran, of course, but I think that the reality of the matter is that if you take away the sort of force and the sort of threats and intimidation, that the numbers of people who are supporting this regime will be very, very few. And I think, a lot of the supporters are involved in sort of repressive machineries, not necessarily official, but unofficial as well. And so they do have sort of a stake in maintaining the regime, because it's their paycheck, it's their being able to walk around and shoot anyone they want and having this sort of unbridled power. In the past, we've spoken about there being an anti-Islamic backlash in Iran, about the fact that there's a great deal of anti-clericalism in Iran, And, I remember years ago, possibly people thought that that couldn't possibly be true. I remember people saying, well, that's great if that's the case. For many years now at the Council of Ex-Muslims, we've talked about a tsunami of atheism, for example, in the country. And now, you see it as clear as daylight. You've got young people passing by clergy. You've got anti-religious slogans. You've got sexual mixing, the mixing of the sexes, which of course is banned in Iran. So, for example, men and women or boys and girls cannot mix in their canteens, for example, and they're taking their food and sitting together outside. There's all of these ways in which these rules are being undermined. Not only that, it's not just in protest that we're seeing women unveiling and burning their hijabs. But now, if you look at a lot of photos and video footage from Iran, women are actually going about their daily lives without the veil, sitting in restaurants, walking in the shops. So they are undermining these rules in their daily lives and not just in protests. And I think the reality is that an Islamic regime that cannot veil women because it is the most visible form of their control can no longer be an Islamic regime. And it is, in my opinion, the beginning of the end for this regime.
Thank you, Maryam. We have a few more questions, so I'm going to go quickly through them. The next one asks, do you think that financial dependency also puts some sort of obstacle for women to have rights to live in whichever way they want to live?
Well, I think for sure financial dependency is an issue, not just for women living in Iran or Afghanistan, but also for women here in Britain. I mean, at the Council of Ex-Muslims, we work with a lot of women who continue to wear the veil, who continue to go to mosque, who continue to fast during Ramadan, because they are tied to their families. And, a lot of times they wait until they go to university or have a job in order to then move away and break ties with their families and gain some independence. So financial dependency is very, very important. But I think here we're dealing in Iran with a situation where a lot of families are supportive of their children. And you can see that in the memorial ceremonies they're giving for their children who've gone out in the protests. For example, the mother one who was killed in protests previous years. She's 80 years old and she removed her veil in support of the young women and girls in the protest today. So you're seeing support from all generations and from families too. Of course, not all families, but I think that makes it easier for young people to be able to have, because a lot of the people in the protest too are not necessarily working age, they're school children. A lot of those who are in the protests are school age. And as you know, as I mentioned in that clip you saw, that the government said that the average age of those arrested is 15.
Thank you for that. The following question is very similar to another one, so I'm just going to read this one. What practical advice would you give to the general public to support the revolution from the UK?
So practically, I think there's a lot of things that can be done. And, one of them, for example, is to just highlight what's happening in Iran, highlight the names of people who are being killed, video clips of protests, to make sure that it stays in the news and in public, in the public space. If you look at the hashtag Mahsa Amini, it has broken all Twitter records. It has been tweeted 80 million times, 80 million times. And, so we use that for everything we do on Iran. So including that hashtag in everything you do, is important. And don't forget that having people, particularly non-Iranians, who are tweeting about it, who are talking about it, who are raising awareness on it, gives a lot of encouragement to people who are fighting in very difficult and risky circumstances. So it means a lot. It's not just a practical way of bringing information and highlighting the situation, but it's also giving sort of a feeling of solidarity and moral sort of support as well to those who are on the streets. The other thing that can be done is that we have protests every Saturday at Trafalgar Square from 2 p.m. And we're organizing various things, including a women's mass haircutting protest, because, as you know, women are cutting their hair in support of the women's revolution in Iran. So keep an eye out on the actions that we have and join those protests when is possible. And I think another very important thing, and maybe the most important thing, is to put pressure on the British government to write to MPs to ask them to have the government be more clear about its position. It's not enough to condemn, it's not enough to call for investigations, but the Charity Commission is now investigating that organization that has, I think, around £4 million in its account. Imagine the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain and One Law for All are not charities. We were refused charitable status. And you've got an arm of the Iranian regime that has charitable status in this country, putting pressure on MPs to call for the expulsion of Iran from the UN Commission on the Status of Women, helping with calling for an end to Iranian sports groups when we're faced with the situation of, for example, FIFA and the football cup and any sort of thing like that, where there's a need to put pressure on the regime in order to defend the women's revolution. So I think there's so many things that can be done. Writing letters to your editors when you see an article that isn't giving voice to the people there. So I think there's a lot we can all do, and it's really important and useful. And I do think that this is, a revolution that is for everyone, not just for people in Iran. It will have effects across the globe. It will affect the fundamentalism that we see here in the streets of Britain. And so it is a fight that is all of our fights. And I think the more we help to promote it and protect it, the more we can hope that things will change for the better sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. I'm going to again pop in the chat the link so everyone can follow the Council of Ex-Muslims in Britain and also Maryam on her social media and website. This last point that you touched on ties in with another question that someone has asking: is there anyone in government in the UK organizing a government shift towards less support of the regime?
Is there anyone in government? I know that there are discussions, and yes, there are, for example, I think some MPs that are thinking about what to do regarding shutting down the Islamic Center, for example, here in London. I know there are discussions, and obviously the more that they hear from constituents, the more they will pay attention and see that this is an issue that is important to a lot of people and not just Iranians. I remember very clearly the first fight really that I was involved with, apart from refugee rights issues, was the anti-apartheid movement. I felt that it was my movement, and it was, I joined sit-ins. I went to see Nelson Mandela when he came to speak at the Yankee Stadium in New York. I mean, it was as if it is a movement that relates to me and that it was my fight as well. And I think that very much so. Of course, we live in an age of identity politics now where you have to be a certain identity to even be able to speak about something. But I think we need to bring back old-fashioned solidarity politics where it's about the politics, not about people's identities. And the fact that this revolution is a women's revolution, it is the task of all feminists, humanists, secularists to help and support it. And I think it would have a huge impact the more support that it gets. Already, of course, lots of people are supporting this movement in a way that we've never seen before. And of course, even people like Kim Kardashian and Starbucks, you know, the Starbucks icon is cutting her hair. It's a bit absurd, you know, but the point I'm making is not that necessarily they're feminists or that they care, but the fact that when there's pressure, even those who were defending an Islamic regime a few years ago may no longer have that position if they can feel that groundswell of pressure. A good example of this is Reza Aslan, who has been involved in Nayak, and he's, you know, someone who's been promoting Islamism for a very long time. And recently, he said that he is resigning from Nayak. He feels that he cannot be heard and he cannot listen whilst he is Nayak. So this is an example of how public pressure can at least stop people from defending the regime. But it has also widespread effects of putting pressure on governments to end relations with the regime and for this groundswell to reach a tipping point where there will be no alternative but for the regime to go.
Most definitely. I think we have time for just one last question. This question says, what is the current situation on how information is provided within Iran and how information is getting out of Iran? And is there anything that we can do to help?
Yes, I mean, as you all know, that there is, the regime does very often, of course, try to strangle internet access and to cut internet access. In November of 2019, it cut internet access for 3 days and it killed 1,500 people during those 3 days. So when the internet access is shut down, it is a very dangerous situation, of course. Now, unfortunately, I'm not very good with technological things and I don't quite understand how things work, but I do know that Starlink, which you had mentioned earlier, has been, people have been given free access to Starlink as a way of circumventing internet shutdowns. And also there are various proxy somethings that you can do. And those who have the technical know-how, there is information out there on what you can do if you have access to servers to give people the chance to have access to them. The shutdown is not 24/7, so people do use the opportunity to then send out information wherever possible.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Maryam, and thank you everyone for joining us today in this really interesting conversation on the situation in Iran. Thank you also, AJ, for hosting this brilliantly. And I hope to see you, all of you, at any of our future events. Thank you so much.
Can I just ask that if anyone would like to find out more about what they can do, and if they want to maybe work more closely with us on these issues, or even just come to one event like the mass haircutting event, for example, which is going to be #HairForFreedom, to contact me. My email is just Maryam Namazie, my name, @gmail.com, or you know, you can contact me via social media accounts. So please do get in touch. It would be great to have some of you at least working more closely with us if possible. I want to thank Central London Humanists for giving this chance, and I'm so glad to have been here to speak with you. Thank you, and hope to see you in the trenches.
Thank you so much, Maryam.
Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, pleasure to have you. I've been popping in all your contact details in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.